We are very fortunate to have Shane here between his Friday presentation on Evan Dawson's connections. You were excellent, by the way. And a Monday book promo and panel discussion. I don't know if you want to mention that. I'll leave that to you. He's worked tirelessly to help kids and now the rest of us understand Rochester's history and what it means to us today. Shane Wiegand is the co-leader of the Anti-Racism Curriculum Project at Coordinated Care Services Incorporated. That's a mouthful. Previously, he was a fourth grade teacher in the Rush Henrietta School District. He's also a board member at City Roots Community Land Trust and Connected Communities. And for his work with the Anti-Racism Curriculum Project, he was named as one of Rochester Business Journal's 40 Under 40 in 2021. Shane and his wife live in the Beechwood neighborhood of Rochester. And please give a warm welcome to Shane Wiegand.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me? This is good? Excellent. Well, I am Shane Wiegand. It's wonderful to be here sharing with you all. I grew up I went to Third Presbyterian where I was baptized, but then we moved to Webster. Sorry, I'm a West Sider. And I went to Webster Presbyterian as a kid, and I loved it. But I love this, I don't know. Both have beautiful rooms. And you might be winning. I'm not sure, though. It's been a while since I've been back. But it is really an honor to be here, sharing a little of my story, a little of our community's story, and hopefully together we can figure out the story that we want to continue to create, building on that Matthew 25 congregation idea, hopefully rooting some of what you're doing already as a church into some of how we got here, to some of the current inequities, and how people have always, across racial lines, across religious lines, come together to build a more just and equitable Rochester. And it's my hope that today will be one small piece in some of that journey, informed a little bit more by our history. Most of all, I am here today because 9 years ago, I was teaching fourth grade in Rush Henrietta when a little 9-year-old said, "Mr. Wiegand, did Martin Luther King ever come to Rochester?" And I'm going to be honest with you. Lived here my whole life. I had no idea. I was so mad at that kid. I mean, what a great question. How had I not thought of this question before? And it was one of 100 moments where 9-year-olds are definitely smarter than me. And I said, I will look into it. And as I looked into it, I realized Martin Luther King had come. I was just at school number 19, which is named Dr. Charles Lunsford School. And I was doing a training right before I got to this training. And what's really neat about it is that school is named after Charles Lunsford, who tried to integrate the 19th Ward, but was denied by hundreds of neighbors who signed a petition saying they didn't want his kind in their neighborhood. Through his work, he became friends with Dr. King as he challenged housing segregation. And Dr. Martin Luther King actually stayed at his house. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. But this just gobsmacked me that people in Rochester, at the same time my family was buying homes in Rochester suburbs, African Americans, even doctors, couldn't move from Cornhill across Genesee Street. And I started to learn a little bit more and share with my fourth graders. I met amazing teachers like this team right here. Keisha James, whose face is next to my face at the top. She and I co-direct this project together. We're funded by grants from local banks and foundations, some of whom actually are going to appear in a less than positive light in their past and are owning some of that story with this work. I'm also proud to share that our curriculum is now being taught in grades 2 through 12 all across Monroe County, including in the Gates School District. And one thing I think you can do if you respond well to this presentation, and if I pull this off tonight, is to call your school board and thank them for doing this work and offer your support. Because there are some folks that telling just some more of our community's story is being seen as something that we don't want. And it really matters that in districts that are doing it right, like in Gates, that encouragement and support is there. And I would love to answer more questions afterwards. But I'm gonna dive right in. This is the team that I'm a part of. That's my boss, she's great, Keisha Carter, and then Keisha James and I, 2 Keishas. Like, what are the chances, right? But Keisha couldn't make it tonight. Normally we do these together, but she sends her best. And the biggest reason I'm here, other than those fourth graders asking me questions, were the fourth graders that didn't just ask me questions, but challenged me. If you look at the girl in the middle, her name is Kaliat on the right. And she came up after learning about the history I'm going to teach you tonight. And she said, Mr. Wiegand, I think there's a problem with racism at our school. I really like you, but it's not fair that I've never had a teacher who looks like me. And I think that's racism, and we need to talk to the principal about it today. I'm going to be honest with you. I had a panic attack. Then I remembered that I had tenure. And then I remembered Dr. Young. And we just learned about Dr. Young. I'm going to tell you her story in a minute. But she had friends help her when she was fighting the Ku Klux Klan in Rochester. So I said, what about Dr. Young? She's like, oh, Bailey and Simra will help me. And I'll tell you the rest of their story at the end. But these girls got together and with parent permission decided they were going to challenge hiring in Rush Henrietta schools. And I'll give you the rest of their story. But my hope is that when we take action informed by our history, informed by our students and our community in a room full of imperfect bricks that really build a beautiful place, and I just love that brick thing, guys. That's the coolest. The coolest. I want to know more about that story, but I'm going to pause because I'm going to get excited about it. But I'll tell you the rest of their story in a minute. But I'm really excited to share a little bit about this history. The other thing I want to mention is that in the middle, we're going to watch a short film that our project produced that does a much better job than me talking and actually specifically talks about the town of Gates. And it'll be real interesting, I think, as a pause in the middle. It'll carry us on into the end of our conversation where we'll do some turning and talking and sharing out loud today. What else do I want to tell you before I start? At the end, you can find all these slides, all of our curriculum at resistancemapping.org, as well as the documentary and really whatever you want, how to contact us, anything local history. The other thing I want to say is my long warm-up continues. Everything in our project is rooted in restorative practices, in making space for each other, making space for disagreement. We don't have to be in the same place, but we can respect the places we're in. We do this from a place of inquiry. Today, I am not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to invite you to notice. I'm going to invite you to wonder. I'm going to invite you to learn with your peers and fellow congregants and community members and think about, what does this history mean? Can I trust these stories that I'm hearing? How does this fit with my experience? And if some of this is true, how might that inform what I do next? But again, I'm not going to put a political opinion on you or tell you what to think. What I do want is to model how we can have a conversation about race and racism in a way that's rooted in history and that's a little different than the way my Thanksgiving dinner table can often be. So hopefully we'll do it that way. And then finally, with a bias towards action. We don't look at history just to gaze at it, but hopefully to be inspired with our hands and our feet towards justice. Okay. Here's our big questions for today. I'm going to invite us to consider, and there's not one answer, and I hope you have lots of answers to these questions today, but what has prevented our community from being welcoming and affirming, especially here in Gates? How have people worked to build a more inclusive community over our history and today? And how can I or we be a part of building a more welcoming and affirming community? So I want to invite you to hold those questions in our mind. What's prevented us from being welcoming in our communities? How have people worked to change that? And what's our role today? Sound good? We will return to these questions. All right. So the first thing I want you to do is just take a look up at the screen here, at this image. I've broken it into 4 parts. It's a little hard to see, so I'll explain it instead of have you share out. But you'll notice a bunch of blue dots, right? You can see Pittsford, Fairport, Webster, where I grew up, a little bit more on the west side, Hilton, Brockport, Greece, a lot more blue dots. And on this last part of the image of our town, you can see Gates, right? You can see the highway, and then you see the city of Rochester, where you see almost like a crescent shape of green and orange dots, and then a little like this guy right here. That's the city too, right? So you got like Brighton, Gates is out here, the highways. And when we do this with kids, 4th graders are looking at this, they're noticing and wondering, and they're like, what are those dots? Are they people? Are they homes? Is it rental versus home ownership? Is it poverty? Well, this map actually shows race. One blue dot is one white person, one green, one black, one red, one Asian, one orange, one Hispanic. And the next question I always ask my students, notice there's no date. I ask them to think, what year do you think this is? And I'm going to invite you to turn and talk with your neighbor. What year in Monroe County do you think this census data is from? Go ahead, turn and talk. Tell your neighbor. Give me a thumbs up if you got a date. You got a date? Anyone feeling really confident? What do you think? 2020. What else? 2020. Okay, fine. You're almost right. It was 2010. It hasn't changed in 10 years. Maybe Greece, just a little. But this is Monroe County today. And you look at this map, and the next question we ask our students, what story does this tell us? What do you think about this? That this is our community today. What feelings come up? What story does it tell? What questions are raised? And a big thing that always comes up for my fourth graders when I've taught this in my class and teachers across the county is, how did it get like this? Like, why is there such division between where people live based along racial lines? Is this intentional? What's behind this? Is this because people want to live by people who look like them? Like, what's the story? Why is our community so segregated is a question that sometimes comes up. I teach in Henrietta, and you all in Gates is a very diverse school district too. So it's super interesting. Kids in Gates and Henrietta sometimes are like, no, this can't be true. Because their schools look totally different than my school looked like in Webster, where I think I sat by 3 black students in my entire K-12 education. So it's been really interesting to see some of the responses. The fact is, though, that in 2020, our community was ranked number 1 for school segregation. As a state, New York is the most segregated state for schools, but our community, the border between Penfield and Rochester City School District, is the single most segregating school district border in all 50 United States by race and class. Brighton schools are number 6 in the country for school segregation. And again, that's 2020. A few other statistics before we look at the history. When you look at home ownership in our community today by race and ethnicity, 73% of white people in our community own their own home, 55% of Asians, and only 32% of black folks, and 35% of Latinos. And again, I'm going to keep asking you to notice and wonder in your mind right now, what story does this tell you? What questions does it raise? You look at child poverty today. Almost 50% of black children live in poverty in our region. 40% of Hispanic, and 13% of white and Asian. How do we have those numbers? I look at those numbers and a lot of feelings come up for me. Or this graph from Common Ground Health that shows that a child born in Pittsford is expected to live 9 years longer than a child born in the inner city. Like a zip code could mean the difference between 9 years of life expectancy. How is that happening in our community? Might be a question that comes up. And so I just want to pause. And like I said, I'm a 4th grade teacher. And the way we try to do this is to just kind of take in mind that when we look at data, when we look at hard history and hard current facts and realities, we have to pause to check in with ourselves. And in all of our curriculum with kids, we pause, we check in, we think about how we're feeling and decide what we want to do with those feelings. And we actually use these color zones. And if you'll humor me, I want to invite you to consider where you're at. Some of you might be in the blue zone after seeing some of this data, feeling a little down, a little tired, or a little depressed. Maybe you're in the green zone and you feel happy or thankful or calm right now. Maybe you're in the yellow zone and you're feeling a little embarrassed or confused or excited. Or maybe you're in the red zone and you're just kind of angry or you're upset. And I know for me, I feel really thankful to be here and that this data has been displayed by the Community Foundation and Common Ground Health as a form of action. But I feel angry that this continues. So just check in with yourself. How are you feeling? Think about a statistic that if you could change, you would want to change from that data. And let's take a look at how we got here. James Baldwin says this. He says, the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself and to make his own decisions. And I'm going to invite us, as we go through these next few slides in the short film, to think a little bit about how did we get here? to make some of our own decisions about this, what this means for us and our community. So holding those questions in mind, let's dig a little bit deeper. And to do that, I want to give a little bit of language that we use with our students to help frame this in a different way. And this first term, we're going to go way back in history, this first term is called racist policy. This idea that you can have actions that create inequality on an individual level, but it's different when it's on a policy level. So growing up, I kind of learned that racism was when a mean person did something mean to someone else based on the color of their skin. But sometimes a law can have an outcome that causes inequality. So the definition for racist policy we use is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups, written or unwritten laws, rules, procedures, and guidelines that govern people. So I did not know this until I was 25 years old and was expected to teach it, and didn't know how, that in New York State, slavery was the law. That half of the New York State senators and assemblymen in 1800 and 1810 owned human beings in New York State. Over 20,000 people were enslaved across the state and several hundred right here in Monroe County, right? They passed a law that kept enslavement legal for a white man who owned land to do until 1827. That did not change until July 4th, 1827. But when Nathaniel Rochester came to this community, and Nathaniel Rochester actually owned land in Gates. And according to the US Census, Nathaniel Rochester owned 4 people on his farm in the town of Gates, which really surprised me when I was going through the census data, which is all public, because remember, each enslaved person counted for 3/5 of representation in the state. So the data was really precise. But I would argue that Nathaniel Rochester demonstrated an action that was racist by owning human beings. Don't hear me say I'm calling him a racist. You might draw that conclusion. But my invitation is to help us look at actions and ideas and leave the conclusion drawing to you. But the definition we use for this is believing and acting as if something is wrong or right, superior or inferior, better or worse about a racial group. I would argue that Nathaniel Rochester, when he enslaved people, felt that there was something better about who he was because of his skin color that allowed him to enslave and force people to work for no pay in this community. Horatio Gates, who the town is named for, he didn't live here. He also was an enslaver in the United States, as was Daniel Penfield, Samuel Morris, William Fitzhugh, a whole host of folks in our community that were our leaders. On the flip side is this term anti-racist, which I want to offer to you again as an adjective, not as an entire person or identity. We think of this term as the opposite, believing and acting as if racial groups are equals and actively resisting racism. Austin Stewart was enslaved in the Rochester area. He escaped, he found an ally in Canandaigua who hid him, he learned to read, and then he opened the first Black-owned business and school in downtown Rochester. 4th graders in Gates got to read his autobiography this year, and in 7th grade. It was really cool. There's an amazing book you can Google online that he wrote about what it was like being enslaved in Rochester, his escape, and the community he tried to build. There's no Frederick Douglass in Rochester without Austin Stewart inviting him, which I think is really kind of cool. And he took action for equality. So I want you to keep this in mind. Individual actions for equality, individual actions for inequality, but then laws and policies that are also part of this mix as we dig into our presentation today. So a little context before we go really deep. In 1910 to 1930, there's only about 5,000 Black people that live in our area, maybe 100 or so Puerto Ricans, very minimal. It's a predominantly white community in Greater Rochester. But between 1910 and 1970, we have the Great Migration, where nationally over 6 million Black people got on trains, buses, and they moved from the south to the north. With World War I and World War II, there was a big opening of access to jobs, to different opportunities. Up here, it was particularly fruit picking. Folks from Sanford, Florida, especially came up to pick in Scottsville, Hilton, Marion, and Wayne County, those sort of areas. And when they came, they couldn't find a place to live in Hilton or Scottsville or Wayne County unless you wanted to live in the shacks without running water on the campgrounds. So people would take the train, and there was like a train that ran every day that you could come from a rural area right down to Joseph Avenue. And that's what people did. Because when they went to try to find a house in the surrounding areas or in the city, the first barrier they met of many was the local real estate board, who in their code of ethics barred realtors from selling homes to non-white people in white neighborhoods. Frank Drum and the leaders of the Rochester Real Estate Board actually enforced this policy. Howard Coles, whose daughter is on our board, was the first black realtor in Rochester, and he showed a black family a home in Brighton and was forced out of the real estate board because he had broken their code of ethics and could no longer sell homes in our community. And it didn't matter how much money you have. Dr. Walter Cooper, he's over 94. He's still with us. He's also on our board and is incredible. He would love to come talk to you anytime. He talks about how he confronted housing segregation in 1954. He answered ads for 69 apartments and was denied at every single one of them. He and his wife, Helen, were 2 of the 4 black people that were allowed to work at Kodak out of over 16,000 employees. And he had a PhD in chemistry from U of R, first black person to do that. His wife had a master's degree. You have upper middle class folks, 69 apartments, couldn't live at a single one. They ended up subletting a home from a black family on Webster Avenue. And it wasn't just the realtors. There was something bigger that was going on that the realtors had advocated for with the banks and others. And so as Dr. Cooper was denied these homes, what he always tells the kids is he said, I was angry. I was in the red zone. And I decided that Helen and I were going to do something. So they got involved in the NAACP and they started going to the banks. They found white allies. And together they would go to the banks and say, I can afford it. Give me a mortgage. And they started to realize that no bank, including ESL, or Eastman Savings and Loan, would loan to African Americans. So they realized they needed to build more power and get more organized to make that change and confront this policy called redlining. And in just a second, and you can plug that back in if you'd like, sir, we're gonna watch this short film that you'll hear Dr. Cooper in that's gonna tell a little bit of the story of redlining and racial covenants and the story of 2 families and youth that have been taking some action to correct that legacy today. You're also gonna see the town of Gates, its school board and its town board play a prominent role in one part of the documentary. After the film, I'm gonna have you turn and talk. I'll actually pause it in the middle, but there'll be a moment where I'm gonna ask you to reflect, and again at the end, and then we're gonna look at some more stories of civil rights in our community and build from the hard stuff to the ways people have fought back. So as you watch, I want you to keep our big question in mind. What's prevented our community from being welcoming and affirming? How have people in the past and present worked to build a more just community? Sound good? All right, here we go.
The preamble to the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Realtors begins with, "Under all is the land. Upon its wise utilization and widely allocated ownership depend the survival and growth of free institutions and of our civilization." Have you ever wondered about your hometown and how it came to be? The history of the homes and the people on your street? Have you noticed differences between the neighborhoods we call home?
When you consider the definition of apartheid to be the intentional segregation of various communities based on race and ethnicity, it would be hard to argue that it's not.
I told you I was president of the real estate board. Most of this integration is lip service from people and the government. As a matter of fact, I didn't know of too many black people in Brighton. I had people call me up and say, I understand you sold this house on Eastman Avenue to a black person. And if that's the case, boy, you're never going to sell another house in Brighton again.
The process of moving to Rochester was scary. We initially did want to live in the city of Rochester, but it really couldn't work out where our 2 children would be in the same school at the same time. My sister-in-law looked at 2 houses. This was one of them. And when she came, she said, you guys need to come immediately, put an offer on this house. I think it's right for you guys, for where you are and what you need. I don't seek out places where I am the only person of color. Just living in Meadowbrook and just walking around my neighborhood, it became clear that I was the only person of color that I had seen in the neighborhood. I guess as an adult and how I operate in the world, there's this idea of being seen, right? That people are seeing you, that they make eye contact with you, that you exist, that they say excuse me to you, that you're not invisible. And then moving to a small town like Rochester, immediately how invisible I felt. I didn't know why I felt so invisible or so overlooked. And then eventually I said, okay, what's going on? Like, something's up. And I'm like, oh, this is a racist town. Okay, they don't want to see me.
My neighborhood is very mixed. We have African Americans, we have Americans on the other side, we have Dominicans on one side, we have Puerto Ricans here, and it's very mixed. Even though most of the time we don't talk to each other, when something happens, everybody gets together. We have shootouts from one side to another. The kids, my daughter won't go outside. She was like, if I'm not outside, she ain't going outside. I want my daughter to be able to go outside and play. It's upsetting to me that 8-year-old, 9-year-old is worried about those things. I like living here, but at the same time, I don't want to. They see they're Hispanic or they have some type of help, like Section 8 or housing, and they're like, oh no, they're bad people. Automatically, there's a label on them. So it's you can't move to a better place unless you either buy a house or something, because you have such a bad reputation just because you're in the system. That's one of the reasons why I can barely move. I can't move from here.
My mom is everything in this house. She's the cook, the cleaner, the babysitter, the driver, the teacher, the counselor. She's the real reason this house is still standing. She's everything in this house.
Joshwan and his high school classmates produced a documentary on the legacy of segregation in Rochester, based on the history they learned from the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project.
Before the film, I knew nothing, no type of information about redlining. I figured through social media and everything that I've saw, there's always this tension between people of America. It's a history that we were not taught, but it's a history that we deserve to know. And it's a history that you shouldn't block out just because it was a dark part of this free and perfect America.
Starting after World War II, thousands of Black Southern migrants began arriving in Rochester, New York. They were fleeing oppressive racial discrimination in the South and hoped to find better conditions in the North. Better jobs, better housing, better schools for their children. It didn't take long for them to realize that racism was a problem in Rochester, even if it looked different from what they were used to. The first clue likely came when they went looking for an apartment to rent or a house to buy. Almost all the Black Southern migrants who arrived in Rochester found a place to live in one of two neighborhoods. The 3rd Ward, also known as the Clarissa Street neighborhood, or the 7th Ward near Joseph Avenue.
As a matter of fact, there were many blacks who wanted to move out of certain blighted areas, but found that the realtors were not willing to assist them.
The wife and I answered ads to 69 ads for 69 apartments, and we were refused for all of them.
It wasn't a coincidence that Black people ended up in these two neighborhoods, and it wasn't just because they wanted to live near people like them. Instead, they were kept by a complex web of racist policies endorsed by the United States government and maintained by the city and county governments, the real estate and banking industry, and many others, even as the neighborhoods became overcrowded and dilapidated. One important policy was the National Housing Act of 1934 and dates back to the Great Depression. The federal government created programs to help people buy a house or stay in their home even if they were struggling to make their payments. But not every family or every house qualified for these programs, Instead, the government wrote rules and drew color-coded maps of cities like Rochester to determine where it would help people. Neighborhoods with mostly white people, including those in the suburbs, got color-coded green or blue. That means the government helped people buy houses, thereby insuring their mortgages. Over time, Rochester grew beyond simple black and white demographics. Puerto Ricans began arriving in large numbers, followed by immigrants and refugees from Asia and Africa. Neighborhoods with black people or people who were considered foreigners were colored red. Living in a red neighborhood meant the government was unlikely to help you buy a house or stay in your house. This became known as redlining. These redline neighborhoods had been segregated before the federal government made the maps, but the maps made it clear that the United States was tolerating and even encouraging racial segregation. For example, the rules written by the government initially associated race with risk. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values. Natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences, including prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. A high-speed traffic artery or wide street parkway may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street.
If you look at those communities that had been redlined in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, those are those communities where we see more and more a concentration of poverty over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now into the 21st century. What that has created is a system by which we've created artificial barriers. And whenever you put an artificial barrier into place from a policy perspective, you change the ability of folks to engage in social and economic mobility.
To be most effective, deed restrictions should be imposed upon all land in the immediate environment of the subject location. Recommended restrictions should include provisions for the following: prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Of course, not everyone needed help from the government to buy a house, but even those people were prevented from buying houses in white neighborhoods by another policy called racially restrictive covenants. A covenant is an agreement. In a racially restrictive covenant, any person who buys a certain house agrees that when they sell it, they won't sell it to people of certain races or ethnicities. That often included Jewish or Polish people, but it always included Black and brown people. But until 1948, if a Black person somehow managed to buy a house with a racially restrictive covenant, they could be sued in court or forced to leave the house. The government, in other words, was using its enforcement power to uphold these racist agreements.
The county board of supervisors and the county administrator back in the 1930s were actively involved in pursuing restrictive covenants for towns, I believe in Irondequoit and in other places in Monroe County, that were codified in the local law. So, at the time, the county government was an active participant in this.
No one knows exactly how many there are, but researchers estimate that there are more than 10,000 properties in the Rochester area with racially restrictive covenants. This deed for the subdivision of Gatesville is an example of how local institutions legally agreed to racially restrictive covenants, including First Federal Savings and Loan Association, Gates School Board, Town of Gates, County of Monroe, Eastman Savings and Loan Association, Kodak Employees Association, and Rochester Savings Bank. Other institutions with known covenants in their deeds include the Roman Catholic Diocese of Rochester and Somerville Fruit Farms owned by the Wegmans family. At the time redlining and racially restrictive covenants were in effect, most people in the Rochester area, Black and white, lived in the city. That began to change when the government offered unprecedented help to white people to buy affordable houses and new developments in the suburbs.
You know, it's really interesting. One of the communities that did have restrictive covenants in place was right in the 24th District, the Meadowbrook neighborhood of Brighton. That was a neighborhood that was planned out by Eastman Kodak and pulled together, but done so in a way that had, very deep restrictive covenants in it.
Meadowbrook, written or unwritten, has always been restricted. And in a market where a person can sell his property to whomever he so pleases, the seller usually having much regard, as they say, for their friends and former neighbors, are not going to sell to people who they think are going to evaluate or depreciate the property or make their friends and neighbors unhappy, so they sell it to attractive people. Many people today still will not knowingly sell to Jewish people or Black people.
This government support helped 35 million white families reach the middle class and pass wealth on to their children. How much wealth? In 2020, the median white American family has $188,000 in total wealth, compared to $24,000 for the median Black family. That's 7 times more wealth for a white family. Where does that wealth come from? About 75% of white families own a home, versus less than half of Black families. Home ownership represents wealth that families can borrow, sell, or pass down to their children. When the government denied people of color the opportunity to buy homes, they were denied the opportunity to build generational wealth the way white families have done. People of color weren't just kept from buying houses, they were being excluded from the American dream. This is how redlining and racially restrictive covenants continue to have an effect today.
I think we look around Brighton and see a very white town. No matter how much we want things to be different, I think we don't see integrated neighborhoods the way we'd like to. The topic of restrictive covenants came up quite a few years ago. And so it was probably about that time that my awareness kind of kicked in that maybe there was more here that could be learned about Brighton's position with this phenomenon. This is the Meadowbrook original deed for the Meadowbrook neighborhood. It says, "No lot or dwelling unit shall be sold to or occupied by a colored person."
So when I realized that there was actually a covenant in the deed for this home that we purchased, it was confirmation that these neighborhoods that developed, they were done by design, right? And not as naturally occurring experience where people just decided to live near people that either looked like them or same socioeconomic status. This proved to me that there was an effort by many groups of peoples and systems in order to segregate, lawfully at this time, segregate people based on race. So by learning about the covenants, they did not change the way I felt about where I live just because I think it's as American as apple pie. When CORD first started, it was a couple of neighbors that got together. We decided that, we're going to look in our deed and see what we can do and how we can make changes. CORD stands for Confronting Our Racial Deeds, and really was about the racist acts that were committed, in Meadowbrook and the greater Rochester area. What we learned we could do is we can revoke this particular covenant from our deed and that we can amend it by putting our own language. And we decided that we would use the New York State Fair Housing language.
Now, therefore, it is mutually agreed as follows. Paragraph 12 of the restrictions is hereby revoked, rescinded, rejected, disavowed, and repudiated in its entirety. Paragraph 12 of the restrictions is hereby replaced with the following provision. The sale or occupancy of any lot or dwelling shall not be restricted on the basis of race, creed, color, disability, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, military status, age, sex, marital status, lawful source of income, or family status.
What have I seen as far as the change in the town since court initiative? I'm afraid not as much change as I would have liked to see. That I haven't seen other neighborhoods picking up the torch. I think a lot of the neighborhoods that haven't had restrictive covenants in their deeds, like Bel Air and Houston Barnard and some of the other neighborhoods, are kind of saying, "Phew, guess we dodged that one." But yet their neighborhoods are no more integrated than Meadowbrook. So I don't think there's been much change, disappointingly.
What will you do? We all have a voice and a choice to take action in our own community.
The Rochester Teen Film Festival is a celebration of youth filmmakers.
But maybe some of the most important films are those that educate us. The movie that won this year was The Unattainable Dream, Redlining in Rochester.
It was just an amazing moment to be in.
I wasn't expecting it the way it turned out. It turned out great. Very proud of him. I honestly saw a side of Joshua that I never seen before.
Joshua and his classmates produced an award-winning student documentary to educate others.
You could tell that everybody was glad that they were a part of it, because you can see as like, I am a part of something that can possibly change the world.
You know, even though everything doesn't go as planned, you still have to keep going, you know. Have my kids, have my family, have everybody that depend on me. And I have to wake up, do breakfast, send the kids to school, make sure to go to work, and come home and do it all over again the next day.
Janita and her neighbors organized to confront racism in their deeds and advocate for an inclusive neighborhood.
If not now, then when, right? We could have put it off again. We need to get the law passed. Then what do we need to do to get that passed today?
This is a call to action. What will you do in your community?
Okay, so if I could bring you back together, we'll have some more time. The things that we're not necessarily proud of that we need to own, but always paired with stories of agency and action, like the Coopers, like so many who have fought to make a difference. I do want to mention you can go online and you can look at every neighborhood. You can look at Gates. Let me highlight, there's Brookley, by Brookley Country Club in Gates. That was built by Alliance Realty in the 1940s and subsidized by the FHA. You can see that on the bottom. It was green lined. and every neighbor, every home in Brooklyn. I think it was 250 homes built by Norman Hike. It's actually featured in Richard Rothstein's new book, which is a huge, he wrote The Color of Law. That was a New York Times bestseller. He'll be here actually next Monday if you want to see him. He'll be downtown at the Lyric Theater. That's going to be at 1. I'll email that as well. But he'll talk about Gates and some of those builders actually in this national book. But notice Italians and Irish were seen as inferior. On Joseph Avenue, Hebrew and Italians were part of why it was rated hazardous. But in 1944, the federal government, through the GI Bill, deemed Italians and Jewish people legally white. As the US was entering World War II and the eugenics movement in the United States started to die as Hitler took eugenics to its natural outcome in like the Holocaust, all of a sudden those people were allowed to assimilate, but not black folks until 1968. You can see this eugenics movement. Churches all across Rochester, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Unitarian, actually had Sunday school classes on keeping the Caucasian race clean. You'll see right here, the American Super Race Foundation would meet weekly at the Hotel Rochester, and they had a call for a Congress of Superior Caucasians. Hitler got his ideas from U of R, Cornell, Princeton, Harvard, and Yale that were publishing this idea that white people who were Protestant were a superior race. And you see that literally get put into the mortgage assessment process, subsidized by the federal government. George Eastman at Kodak refused to hire Jewish people and black people in his factories or in his places. No one was hired until James Lavelle, who won the silver medal, and he wasn't hired until he got hired in England after Eastman had died. Then Dr. William Knox was the second black person hired, Sam Dent, and then the Coopers. Kodak was actually written up in 1939 as being discriminatory by the New York State Senate because they had one black employee out of 16,000. So keeping some of this in mind, you can see how that plays out. Even the executives in blackface. George Eastman was the largest funder of the American Eugenics Society, helping spread these ideas. I didn't learn that part in school when we learned about clicking and the camera, and my family worked at Kodak. I didn't know. And it doesn't change the incredible things he did, but it's part of the story. So how do we tell that? Or that at the Red Cross that Eastman built in Rochester, their policy locally and nationally was that they did not accept blood from black people. So Dr. Lunsford, our first black physician, got to know Dr. King because he got on the national map because of this. He sent several of his lighter-skinned black friends to lie and say they were white, and they donated their blood. On the front page of the paper, he published a letter to the editor saying what had happened. It was a national scandal. From Washington, D.C., the Red Cross leadership came to Rochester. He got put on the national board, and the policy changed nationally. And this is the year 1944. How many lives were saved because of that action as we went into World War II? So kind of some of these local stories, right? You can see it, and you can also see this through line past to present, from that red line map to where you see people living today. It's illegal, and yet it was just illegal, right? There was no making up for black families not getting a mortgage. So for my family, we moved to Greece in 1950. We couldn't have bought that home without the government subsidy. Keisha, if she were here, would tell you about her grandfather. Same age as mine, worked just as hard, owned his own business, just like my grandfather. But he could not get a loan anywhere. He couldn't buy a house, so he ended up renting right over here off of Joseph Avenue. And in 1970, once it was legal, he bought his first house. But the only place he could afford by then was off of Avenue D, where he still lives. And his house is worth about $35,000. Before my grandpa passed, he sold his home in Greece for over $100,000. And I inherited some of that money when he passed away last fall, right? My family wasn't rich. My family worked hard. We're proud of those things. And yet we got extra help from nothing we did other than appearing white, right? So that context for me has been a motivator in not just telling the story, but in the work I'm doing in the community. And as I start to think about that, and I want to invite you to think about your own story, whether you're not from Rochester or somewhere else. There was a map made for almost every city in the United States. You can click on the neighborhoods and see the ratings. Locally, the impact was significant. By 1958, 80% of all black people, according to the New York State Assembly and this commission that they put forth, 80% of all black people lived in the 3rd and 7th Ward, the two red line neighborhoods of Rochester. And in 30% of those neighborhoods, of those apartments, there was not running water. They had outdoor outhouses. 1958. Rats and roaches, garbage pickup, it was a significant issue. And not because the people didn't care in the neighborhood, because the investment, the government, there were some significant things happening. So as always, people fought back. What I say to kids is Dr. Cooper, he got angry. He went to the banks. He realized that there were these big barriers in his way. And he realized how he felt. He said, I was in the red zone. And I decided I was going to take that anger and do something with it. He says to kids, and at school number 10, which is named for him, to never give up. You're either involved or you're not. There's not a middle ground, and I choose to be involved. And he took those big feelings, and he did get involved. And I want to invite you just to pause one more time and just check in with yourself. How are you feeling? What's coming up? What zone or zones are you in? I'm going to be honest with you. I hate talking about feelings. Keisha makes me do this. She loves feelings. She's a therapist and a teacher. But the thing is, even if it's not present, like for me, I was taught to stuff all the feelings down, but they're still there. And just taking that pause to check in with how you're doing right now, the cognitive dissonance, the anger, frustration, or maybe even pride in some of these people we're learning about who fought this, just notice it. Give yourself some grace, take a deep breath, and let's learn a little bit more about how people fought back and these policies came out. So Dr. Cooper went to every bank in town, Rochester Savings, Lincoln Alliance. Not a single one of them would give him a loan. So he gets involved with the NAACP. He found allies. They started to build power. They started holding forums. They brought Malcolm X to town. They had 500 people see Malcolm X at Baden Street Settlement House. All of a sudden, the city started to be a little scared. Some of the banks started to realize there's some troublemakers out here. No longer can we kind of just keep this to the side. And so in 1958, Dr. Cooper and Helen Cooper bought a house in Henrietta. They were the first black people to live in the town of Henrietta. 9 other black people joined them. And by 1960, Henrietta, because of the NAACP, was the most integrated suburb of Rochester with 11 individual black people. That was more than any other suburb in the area. My 4th graders, where there's like half my class is non-white and there's 10 different languages being spoken, could not believe. Like Dr. Cooper had to tell them. Like, he had to zoom in for them to trust it, even though it was in the paper. Another example might be Dr. Alice Young. She's a good friend. She's also in her mid-90s, still with us. She helped found MCC. She was the first black principal in Monroe County. Sorry about that. And in 1957, she said, you know what? I've had it. I need more place for my kids to play. I'm going to move into a bigger house in the 19th Ward. I got my PhD. I went to Cornell. Like, I should be able to live where I want, and I'm not afraid. So she goes to the banks. Not a single bank will give her a mortgage for the 19th Ward. Not a single realtor will show her a home. So she finds Mrs. Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph fortune, who was a member of the NAACP. She bought her a house, sight unseen, 99 Millbank Street. It still stands. And she sold it to the Youngs illegally under the table and lied on the deed and said that Alice was her niece. The Youngs moved in the middle of the night because they heard they were definitely not welcome and they knew they were breaking legal and social norms. The next morning, they found robed members of the Ku Klux Klan in their front yard with a burning cross. 1957, Rochester, New York. This is East Rochester in the 20s and 30s. There would be regular gatherings of 10 to 20,000 Klans members. At this gathering, they burned 3 50-foot high crosses outside of East Rochester High School, where it stands today, and led a parade with their families in full robes down Main Street of Greater Rochester. So there was racial intimidation, there was the banks, there was the realtors, there was a lot going on. Lunsford, who I mentioned earlier, you can see Lunsford sitting next to Dr. Martin Luther King at his home on Elmwood Avenue. He had to overcome a petition of hundreds of neighbors that tried to keep him out. In Gates, one family got really creative. Mr. and Mrs. George Harding moved into Rossmore Street in Gates, and they lied and said they were white. They were lighter skinned, they were upper middle class, and they kind of did their best white voice impression, is what they describe in the newspaper article. And that's how they moved in. And they kind of slowly let neighbors know and eventually found some acceptance in Gates after an ease-in process. At 15 Shrubbery Lane, the Clark family attempted to move in 1962. There was a petition of several hundred neighbors from the surrounding area that said, you are not welcome because of your race in Shrubbery Lane. So they still moved in, but they only made it a couple years before moving back to the city. So there's a lot of stories like this, right? Those are just the ones in the paper or folks that I had the chance to interview after a presentation like this. But there's so much more. Like these racial covenants, we talked about that deed from Gates. The town hall actually sits. My understanding is it sits on that racial covenant. Like there is a chance for the town to do something and the surrounding neighborhood. Hope Hall, which used to be school number 4, is where that deed still stands, saying no one not of the Caucasian race can use it. It's illegal. You can't enforce it. You can't take someone to court if a black child goes to Hope Hall or goes into the town hall, and yet it's still there, right? So what do we do about things like that? You can see the school board right there. You'll see these in Webster. Notice the advertisements in the paper for these racial covenants. St. James Church in East Irondequoit, the Bishop O'Hearn put this right on the deed. Walter Wegman of the Wegmans family, Kodak, of course. Even right here, no Jews, black people, or Italians. Don Hartwood, they wrote a puff piece about him in the paper and the great restrictions he'd put on his family's homes on their street. Or the president of the real estate board. There's Norman Hike, who built the homes in Brooklyn, right here in Gates. Or you can see Earl Case, who built the Gates Acre Gardens division in Greece, or in Gates right here, that had those same racially restrictive covenants, helping other lawyers help their clients do that same whites-only practice. But again, and as always, black people and their allies fought back. Judge Reuben Davis describes the situation. He was the second black lawyer in Rochester, later became our first black judge. Here he is, a lawyer. He should be able to live anywhere he wants. He's denied a house at 135 Elmdorf Avenue. There was a covenant on the deed, so they wouldn't sell it to him. Nothnagel Realty enforced that covenant and prevented him from moving in. So we found an ally at the NAACP. He describes himself as resorting to devious methods. And that was how he was able to get the house, because his friend bought it and sold it to him under the table, which was very common for upper middle class black folks up through the 50s and the 60s. Online, you can go to resistancemapping.org and you can zoom in and look at the neighborhoods, find the locations, and you can change these deeds. The Bar Association will support you and help you. They have a whole guide for how to change your deed. It's inexpensive, but sometimes you have to get all the neighbors on board. Meanwhile, in the face of this discrimination in redlined and segregated neighborhoods, real community was being created. Black churches like Baber AME, Mount Olivet, Memorial AME, they were coming together, not just fighting racism in the marches on the streets, but by joy, by their faith, by their singing, by parades, by all-night jazz sessions at the Pithod Club in Shep's Paradise. So remembering that piece too, real safety and community was built in these redline neighborhoods that was destroyed after urban renewal. Meanwhile, at the schools, we had something called blackface minstrel shows. Every school district in Monroe County in the 50s and 60s put on shows where students and teachers would dress up in blackface. Often these shows were held at local churches. You can see here, Honeyway Falls, Lima, 4th graders in blackface, spectacular blackface minstrels, front page of the paper, 1960. You'll see these RCSD schools, Gates, Kodak, all over our community, Allendale, Aquinas. You'll see here almost every school in Gates performed a blackface minstrel show. And I'm going to be honest, the next slide is not a fun slide to share, but I'm not sure if it was this location, but the Gates Presbyterian Church in 1955 partnered with the Harding School PTA to put on a blackface minstrel show at the church building as a sponsorship for the school. You know, so thinking about these stories and how close they are to our communities, and it's not just singling you all out, it was every church and community across this area. It was the norm, and it was another tool to say our town should look a certain way, and it wasn't just endorsed by the government, but by the church. But again, not all churches. The Reverend Primo at St. Simon's, the only integrated church at Rochester, he integrated the town of East Irondequoit. He overcame the petitions. The bishop actually interceded and forced a realtor to sell him the house. He moves in and sends his kids to school, and they have to go to a blackface minstrel show in East Irondequoit. So he starts a county-wide campaign with the NAACP, writing letters to the editor like this one, calling for an end of these blackface shows that didn't end until 1968, after Dr. King's assassination. St. Simon's Episcopalian Church. Yep. There's a whole book about him that his son wrote that's really cool. Yeah. Very neat guy. And Strike the Hammer by Laura Warren Hill talks a lot about his role in the civil rights movement. He was the president of the NAACP for a while after Lunsford. But again, I'll share all the slides with you too. There's links in there. Meanwhile, it wasn't just that. Legally, the schools were being segregated. You can see the majority of all white schools in the city school district, but notice in the red line neighborhoods, School 9 and School 3 were over 95% black and brown. So you start to see like a pattern. It's not just schools, it's in each of these locations: healthcare, housing, the churches. You see a whole lot going on, even violent protests with riots, white families throwing rocks at black students in 1971. We all know the famous Ruby Bridges picture of her walking to school. That happened at Charlotte and Monroe High School in Rochester when these schools integrated. Terrifying experience for those black children in their attempts to integrate. Students like James Beard and the Black Student Union organized with the elders at a civil rights group called Fight that had challenged Kodak to make protective mobs of parents to help the kids get into the building, sometimes having to escape from Charlotte High School on back buses in the back that the kids would have to sneak out to. They walked in groups of threes in the hallways to stay safe. And so there's a lot going on. You see each of these policies, and yet you still see, even with the fight against it, significant challenges. Schools in our area are the most segregated in the country. And part of that has to do with how racism started to evolve. In 2020, after the killing of George Floyd and Daniel Prude, Monroe County and the city of Rochester, Republicans and Democrats came together and published the RAISE Commission report on racism and structural inequity in Rochester. And in that report, one of their key recommendations about why Rochester has not ever recovered from the redlining and racial covenants is the towns evolved their racism. In the late 60s, towns like Gates, Pittsford, and Penfield could no longer discriminate based on race. But to today, it is still legal to discriminate based on income. So the zoning laws changed in each of the towns here and across the country, making it so it was really difficult to build apartments, small starter homes, townhouses, or big apartment buildings even. Or even a duplex is illegal in most of Gates, in all of Pittsford, right? That was intentional. Leaders of the civil rights movement locally fought this. They thought, yeah, we should have a duplex, or a granny cabin should be allowed on your home. It was illegal. People like Robert Rhodes at the NAACP actually partnered with Joe Wilson, the president of Xerox, who led the Metropolitan Housing Council. Joe Wilson actually said these zoning rules that the towns are doing, this is 1968, he said they were racist and the new racial covenants, and yet the towns move forward, even with the leader of Xerox pushing against. Today, that legacy is carried on, and students of color like Benita, who's a senior in Henrietta, who is calling out her town board for only allowing senior apartments at Marketplace Mall instead of families like her. And she got it changed by speaking to her town board. And again, if a group of 9-year-olds can change things, if a group of seniors in high school, how much so a congregation of folks like yourself? And so my invitation to all of you is to kind of think about, what do we do about some of this data? How do we work to build a more welcoming and affirming community? And to bring it back to the beginning, and why I'm here most of all, do you remember Kalyat, Bailey, and Simra, who wanted to challenge hiring in Rush Henrietta? So after learning this curriculum, Kalyat said, I want this to change, and I want to do it right. And so we got the two friends like Dr. Young had. We researched, we got parent permission. The girls wrote a cutest note ever to the principal and asked if they could have lunch, and they had a problem they wanted to talk about in the school. This poor man was not ready for the power these righteous 9-year-olds would unleash. They sat down with their chicken fingers and said, Mr. Pollard, we've got a problem. And they pulled up their slide deck on their Chromebook with their list of demands, in only the way a 9-year-old can, right? And they said, it's not fair. And I don't think it's your intention, but this seems like a racist policy. Whatever you're doing for hiring isn't working, and it's leading to an inequitable outcome. And he's like, not a lot of black people have been applying for jobs in Henrietta. And Kaliat said, well, why aren't you going and finding them and telling them about the job and letting them know it's safe to apply here? Because I love this school district, and those teachers should know that they can come here and we want them. Why don't you go find them? Let's just say he was like, huh. And then they said, have you ever interviewed a black teacher and not hired him? He started to sweat. It was great. And he said, you know what? Why don't you talk to the assistant superintendent and the school board? And all of a sudden, that summer, the assistant superintendent of HR is flying down to Georgia, recruiting black college students and teachers' colleges at historically black colleges in Atlanta. And the number doubled from 10 to 20. Not enough, but still more than every East Side school district combines number of black teachers. The girls aren't happy, but they made some change, and they changed how hiring's happening. Instead of just putting it on the website, which would be equality, to equity, going out and working for the change, making sure people have what they need. And so the thing that I want to close with is what's prevented us from being welcoming and affirming here in Gates and Rochester? How have people like Kaliat, Joe Wilson, Howard Coles, Dr. Walter Cooper, Dr. Alice Holloway Young, so many, how have they worked to build more inclusive communities? And how does that inform the next steps that you all take, that I take, and we take together in our county and in our towns? I want to give you 2 or 3 minutes just to share with your neighbors, then we'll share out and we'll close. Sound good? Go for it. All right. If we could bring it back together for the last couple minutes, I would love just to have folks share out any responses to the presentation or these 3 questions, what you were talking about. And I also just have to say, my 2nd grade teacher is here, Miss Morse. She's why I became a teacher, literally my favorite teacher on the first day of school. Oh yes, just so cool. It doesn't get any better than this. Yep. I just love it. My whole day is made. It's the best. So, there is a microphone. So my hope is, though, that we could share out just reflections. What did you notice and wonder about some of our local history? What stood out to you about how people worked for change in our community and what our role is today? And you're welcome to share anywhere in there. My hope is that we keep this conversation going and that we don't just look at the problem, but we start to think about what we do and how this place becomes a part of that change. So who has a thought? Over here.
Anybody? Raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you.
Right here. We got one.
There we go.
I'm a preacher. I don't really have much to say, but that doesn't stop me. I just wanted to get the conversation going. I like the way that you've presented the questions, because I think there's a natural progression that can help us as we have this conversation with others, which is, how did we get this way? Because I think we all bring a lot of assumptions to that. And then how have people worked, and we hear these very admirable stories of very brave people, and then how can we join them as kind of the ending? How can we continue together with them? It's a great way to put it together. Thank you.
Thank you. That was exactly what we were going for. Glad you liked that. Up here.
I'm struck by how little has changed. I mean, it's from 68 to, it's 50 years ago. And we're virtually as segregated as we were then. But I was also struck this spring when the banking crisis occurred. We've got to bail out these wealthy folks who've got all this money in the banks and make them whole. And yet there's no conversation about how that equity that was being protected was equity that was developed out of this redlining, out of the generational wealth. I mean, that's where the folks that have $250,000+ in the bank come from. And yet that was never a part of the conversation.
That's such a smart point to bring up, and how we're told things like it's just normal. And one of the things we do with our students, we have these social studies superhero roles, and my personal favorite is the Credible Hulk. And he always asks, can we trust this? Is it reliable? And my other favorite is Mr. E, like mystery, Mr. E. It's really great. It kills in 4th grade. But his job is to figure out whose voice is missing, what the mystery is of the text. And you see some of the subtext in those articles that I would have looked at 5 years ago and thought, yeah, I guess they're too big to fail. Or instead of like, wait, who actually bore the brunt of the housing crisis in 2008? It was Black and brown people. They lost significantly more wealth. They were not made whole, whereas JP Morgan and those others were. And I think we have this chance to say, no, the emperor has no clothes. We have these moments to say, okay, we know our history. We can recognize what's happening here. And if that's the decision you're making and what you're seeing, okay, how do we make it so it's not just your voice or my voice in the comments section and the Washington Post, but it's something that our local leaders hear and that our representatives hear, and that all of a sudden you're a friend and a thorn to Chuck Schumer and whoever. But it matters. It's small groups of people advocating and finding a way to make their voices as loud as one of those people. It felt impossible after 69 apartments for Dr. Cooper to find somewhere to live. But he found people that helped make his voice bigger, and he saw his own power in a bigger way and was able to integrate Henrietta, which felt impossible in 1958, right? Dr. Young overcame the Klan. We can call out these banks or whoever it is, or the issue that you care about. How do we have that hope? I mean, I feel like with our Christian faith, in a room like this, we are called to have hope that on the 3rd day he rose. Can that not be true when it comes to racial justice? Rochester doesn't have to look like this, is how I feel. So let's go into it armed with what you just said. I like it. Who else?
I believe there is mentioned now there's more of discrimination based on income. Perhaps that's the guise that's used rather than racism. I was just curious. It seems to me a few years ago, maybe around 2017, there was a lot of energy and publicity generated about a Monroe County Poverty Initiative. In the last I have not heard much about that, and I remember when it was first developed, it said if we don't do something, we'll never be able to get any kind of a major program started again. And I just was wondering if you are aware of any developments that have taken place there.
So if you're not familiar, I think, what was it, 2015 or so, 2016? About $30 million from New York State was allocated to Monroe County and the Finger Lakes to create something called RMAPI, or the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, who had the goal of cutting poverty by 50% in Monroe County over the next 15 years. That's not happening. It's gone up. Dr. Leonard Brock oversaw it. There was a big committee. There's still a huge steering committee with some of the biggest names in Rochester still meeting monthly and talking about it. It's now led by Aqua Porter, who I personally think is incredible and doing really good work. There's been some quiet but big victories around minimum wage at a state and local level where there's been significant change. You can learn a lot more at their website, endingpovertynow.org, or you can find it on the United Way's website. There's important stuff that is happening with housing and income that they've focused on, and childcare. They're working on policy change, not on putting in new programs. They started maybe too loud when they should have started a little quieter, is some of the way the new leadership has talked about it, because they didn't realize just how much resistance that they would receive. So one of their victories was that in the city of Rochester, a landlord could say, I will not rent my apartment to you because your income is subsidized by the government. So if you have Section 8 or DSS, whereas my grandfather couldn't have bought his house in Greece if it wasn't subsidized by the government. That was seen as just being an American in the 1950s. But if your family needs extra support today, it's seen as a handout, right? Or as it's seen as an entitlement that you don't deserve. It's just interesting how that gets framed, I guess, so that income, you no longer can legally discriminate on income, and yet New York State has not allocated any resources to enforcing that or calling out those landlords in the city or in our suburbs where that continues to be the norm. It is almost impossible, my social worker friends tell me, including my wife, who's a social worker, to find housing right now for folks that receive assistance or single moms who are just going through a tough time. It's really tough. So that change is big. And so there are a lot of folks at RMAPI, but then the RAISE Commission, which I mentioned earlier, which is building on that and working with that on concrete policy that is being supported through RMAPI. It's still a few too many cooks in the kitchen maybe, but they're pushing the policy change to dismantle structural racism, and they need support. And so you can also go to rockraise.org. That's rockraise.org. And I can put that in this turning into a giant email. I apologize, Mary Beth. But it'll be in there if you want to look, and you can get on board. Lots of churches are a part of it. There's these groups that are overseeing each of the 9 areas, from mental health, poverty, to healthcare, to housing discrimination, looking at these areas, to elder care. How can we change things in the local legislature, in our town boards, state and nationally? And they're building those roadmaps. So there's some really good work happening. I would recommend having Dr. Candace Lucas come, or Aqua Porter from RMAPI. The two of them, I'd love to put anyone here in touch to have them come talk about the nitty gritty and to really ask them, how can we support that? I just worked with a group of high school seniors. We brought in the leadership and they were like, okay, we care about housing. And they helped walk them through what it would look like and how to advocate at a town board meeting for what they're proposing with zoning changes. They did the same thing in Henrietta. So there's real ways that if we decide we pick one of the areas, because we know what needs to change in a lot of ways, but it's just a matter of buckling down, finding the right people to ask for advice, and then taking the steps, just like you would to put on a service or a pageant or whatever you do at churches these days, kind of a thing. Like, we can do the same thing with a couple extra meetings at the town board or with our local legislature. So follow up on those, I think, would be great. Right here.
So as I was driving here, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about what can still be passed in the New York State legislature, because there's not much time left. And one of the things they talked about was the governor's housing bill that got cut from the budget. And one of the reasons that it didn't have support is because from suburbs, it would mean that this bill would have overridden some of their zoning laws. And it just clicked for me that this is probably very related, that there are suburbs who don't want that affordable housing and want to be able to keep those zoning laws the way they are and not have them overridden so that that housing doesn't get built.
I think that is important. If you're not familiar, Governor Hochul in the budget proposed sweeping changes to housing built off of California, proposals in Connecticut and other states. I think Pennsylvania or New Jersey did this because there's a housing shortage, because you can't build smaller homes or even townhomes, duplexes, or apartments. But you get these scare tactics that, like, someone's going to come in and put a tower in the middle of Gates with 300 apartments in it. No one's talking about doing that here. But it would be huge if every suburb in Rochester put in another 500 units, townhomes, duplexes, a mix across their towns, instead of like just the Pines of Parrington, like where it's just one spot segregated from the town, isolated by the roads and hills. Like, what would it look like to do it in a way that's supported and that's going to make the community more diverse? Because that's the other thing, is the worry that the town supervisors that advocated locally, and I talked to a lot of them about this, said, it's going to hurt our property values. And then you say, so why is it going to hurt your property values if, I mean, the numbers are small. If 300 new people move to your town whose incomes might be, instead of $100,000 a year, $55,000 a year, or $35,000 a year, like a mix. And they're like, well, there's just problems with that. And people won't say it because they know you can't say it out loud, but it's right there. In Pittsford, the supervisor, Bill Smith, talked about how at an event just like this at the Pittsford Library, how our town's social character would be impacted. And I pointed out that the deeds in Pittsford used to say, we're protecting the social character by excluding Black people. To which he said, we've never had that in Pittsford. I'm like, no, here's the deeds. It's right here. Well, it was, and you're like, you had the NAACP calling zoning the new racial covenant. You can say, no, it's not. But what's the impact? It's the most segregated state in the country, New York. If we care about that, then we got to care about, I wrote my letter to Governor Hochul saying I support. Did we? Being aware of even a couple issues. I can't be aware of all the issues. You can't be. But you can pick one or two things. You're like, no, I'm going to watch this. I'm going to make sure that my representative knows I care about this issue. I'm going to start to figure out what it looks like, my next step, and then my next step to build power. One example that I want to share that I just shared at School 19 is from our Puerto Rican civil rights curriculum. When kids would come to Rochester from Puerto Rico in the 60s and 70s, there was not bilingual education. If you didn't speak English, you got put in special ed in the basement, and kids would drop out. And so a group of Puerto Rican students, led by Nydia and Nancy Padilla, Roberto Burgos, who helped us write that curriculum, incredible human beings, they were high school juniors and seniors, and they had a press conference, and it didn't work. They spoke at the school board meeting, and it didn't change. So they led a walkout from East High School, Monroe High School, and Benjamin Franklin High School. It still didn't change the policy. So they took over the superintendent's office and did a sit-in, draped the Puerto Rican flag out the window, and 500 parents showed up in the street. The police came, and it looked like there was going to be a riot. Superintendent Franco, this is like 1971, he was scared. He negotiated, and the bilingual council was formed, and now bilingual education is happening in RCSD. It took several years. It's continual accountability and pushing on those issues that groups like Ibero are constantly pushing and saying, hold on, don't cut our budget line over the last 40 years. But that's how change happens. It starts with a small effort, and if it doesn't work, well, let's ramp it up a little. None of us need to be Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. Although I'd argue, Rosa Parks just sat down. You know what I'm saying? She did it really intentionally, really thoughtfully. She was an organizer. She'd gone to civil rights training school. And yet a small act of courage has the ability to spark a larger movement. When I look at Benita challenging her town zoning board, I'm so proud and I'm so angry. Because where are the adults in her town who spoke after her? There were none, right? Just her teacher and 10 of her friends from high school. Like, what does that look like for us to believe that this can happen and to hold some accountability and hopefully with our history connect some of these dots? And again, notice I have not said the word Democrat or Republican today. To me, it needs to be solved from both sides. And we have to have that conversation and get out of the talking points from the news and instead say, what would a policy change that I can support look like that would build the town I want to see, that doesn't just help me, but helps our community? That's my long answer. I apologize. What else we got? You got me going. Any other reflections or questions? Yes, right up here in the front.
There's something about like there's nine a division of 9 groups into nitty gritty areas. What was that?
That's called the Raise Commission. Let me just
And I'm new to the area, so yeah.
So if we look here, Lockery's, there's a whole report you can see right here, full report, and there's 9 areas that they're working on. You can read the whole thing from the short summary. You can see former Mayor Johnson, Chief Counsel of LaSalle, Dr. Shafiq from Nazareth, a big bipartisan committee put together these recommendations. And they have 9 areas: business development, criminal justice, education, healthcare, human services, housing, job creation, and policing. And in each area, there's between 10 and 15 recommendations, and they're in the process of zeroing in on 3 for each and raising a stink. The Urban League is chairing the accountability process for the city and the county and being paid by the city and county to do that. So there's real potential. And you can go to the website and you can sign up and go to any of these meetings, which are happening multiple times a month. You can join me on the housing committee and talk about all things housing. Zoning is our #1 issue. Well, I just want to say thank you for having me. I have a feeling, I haven't looked at my watch, but I think we went over. And I want to say a huge thank you for hosting me in this beautiful room with these incredible bricks. And I also just want to say I'm here, as is Keisha and our team, to support as you continue to think about what kind of work you want to do or how this history might inform you. And the other thing I hope you do is thank a teacher and thank your school board for the good work that they're doing and encourage them, and have a wonderful evening. Mary Beth, is there anything else?